begin there in the light, but you're going to end in wisdom. That is, if the gods prevail. But otherwise, light.
Welcome to Pay Attention, interviews about truth in troubling times. And today I'm here with Stephen Jenkinson. And Stephen Jenkinson is an MTS, Master's in Theology, and MSW. He's an activist, a teacher, an author, and a farmer. And he has a master's degree in theology from Harvard University, a master's in social work from the University of Toronto. Formerly a program director at a major Canadian hospital and clinical assistant professor in medicine. He's now a sought-after speaker, teacher, and consultant in palliative care and hospice. He's the founder of the Orphan Wisdom School in Canada and the subject of a documentary film that was made by the Canadian Film Board. It's called Grief Walker. Stephen is the author of Die Wise, a manifesto for sanity and soul, and Come of Age, a case for elderhood in a time of sorrow. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, man.
Do you like to be called Stephen or Steve?
I like to be called these days in any way at all. So either one of them is fine with me.
Okay, great. I think in my mind, you're Stephen, so I'll probably stick with that.
Sure.
So
Okay.
I'm really grateful to be speaking with you at this time because I feel like we're in such upheaval on so many levels, and that there's something about the way you frame things that will be very helpful. I see your work as being important for sorting out the kind of insanity of what I and others would call safetyism, which is kind of it's a term that refers to a belief system in which safety, including emotional safety, has become a kind of sacred value, meaning that people are unwilling often to encounter even the ordinary risks of life in order to retain this attitude that they're safe. This kind of attitude, I think, is based on a fear of death and also continues a fear of death and a real misunderstanding about life. And so today I want to frame our conversation especially about several of the things that I feel you have real understanding of as well as expertise in. And the first topic will be the meaning of death in our lives. And then secondly, engagement with dying itself, our own death, the deaths of our parents and the deaths of our children. Then the importance of elders in a culture or civilization and the implications of our having abandoned many of our elders in the dying process during this time of COVID, as they've been in hospitals and care centers and other kinds of residential settings where they weren't allowed to have their family members come in and be with them in the dying process. And then finally, how you see and understand the ways in which governments worldwide are handling this crisis of coronavirus in terms of health and immunity, and what the kind of social alienation that we're living in leads to for societies, cultures, families, and individuals. So it's a lot, but I hope we can cover it, at least kind of touch on some of those points.
Well, I didn't write all that down, so I'll follow your lead.
Oh, I've got it down. Don't worry.
Okay.
I kind of manage this thing pretty well.
Okay.
So I'm going to begin with framing this idea of death in our lives. And, as my listeners know, I often move from a Buddhist perspective. And so I want to mention that the Buddha he saw this life that we're in, this existence, as an existence of life and death. They're bound together. I mean, it only makes sense. They are bound together. They're never separated. But specifically in an early teaching that's called the Dhammapada, he taught the importance of death in this short verse. Many do not realize that we here must die. For those who realize this, quarrels end. And to me, this teaches something about the absence of death leading to war and polarization, the absence of the real recognition that we here must die. We're mortals. The Greeks called us the ones who die. We're not the immortals. And that some of the constant repetitive conflicts that people get into in their families, in their cultures, the kinds of polarizations that we see going on right now seem to me to have something to do with refusing to see the role of death in our lives, and that bringing death into our awareness allows us to recognize that our lives are brief and fleeting, and it makes us alert to the value of a precious human life. So, I'm sort of framing the conversation that way. I know that you teach about this a lot. I've listened to a number of your teachings, and I'd like you to just sort of talk to us about the way you view the meaning of death in our lives, in our walking around lives.
Mhm. Oh, I like that phrase, our walking around life. Yeah. Well, let's see. Let me start about 2 or 3 minutes ago. The idea that choose anyone, the Buddha or Jesus or whatever teacher compels you, the notion that they're trafficking in the eternal verities, that there's no modulation necessary or advisable or possible from then till now. That is, that the verities by definition are the same for them as they are for us, and so their pronouncements should be our solutions and this kind of thing. Of course, they're very understandable, and it usually passes without much comment. So that's where I'm going to start and sort of wonder aloud whether or not these things are the same from era to era, and never mind generations, but era to era.
Mm-hmm.
And is everything the same from era to era? Or I'm wondering, as I was listening to your lead up, and I'm not persuaded that much really would be recognizable to us if we were able to go back 2,500 or 4,000 years, and particularly how people are interacting with things that we might have assumed would stand as ruggedly as realistic for them as they would appear to do for us. So there's the first thing. So it's good to be a little uncertain when you go back into the mists of time and pursue the pronouncements that derive from those places and those times. I don't mean doubting. I simply mean to wonder whether or not there's enough that has endured to carry to us the pronouncements of former times. Yeah.
I agree. I think it's the frame of reference or the attitude we bring towards experience is always framed by the moments in which we're arising, those that are around us and that arise with us. And there's much about this moment in time and this period of time that we're in that would be absolutely different from 2,600 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The next thing is the pronouncement that death or dying or the awareness of dying or the proximity of dying more or less inevitably brings us to, and then however you finish the sentence, you do. If it was the case that the proximity to dying inherently reshuffles the deck, makes things clearer, makes the priorities suddenly more available, and all of that sort of thing. If that were true, I can promise you, I would never have had a job in the death trade. There would have been nothing for me to do. Why? Well, because the proximity of death more or less inevitably brings people to their senses, if you will, or to somebody else's senses. And I can tell you from being there And I
Mhm.
have no reason to underplay this or to exaggerate it, but from being there, this is simply not true. It's not what happens. That the capacity of the dominant culture North American person to take dying and to adjust dying to their preferences is absolutely breathtaking. And in that sense, it's the maniacal capacity of a consumer culture
Mhm.
to take whatever would challenge the consumerism of the culture and make it another thing to buy. That's basically the way it works. And that's the way it works in the death trade. It certainly did the whole time I was there. So this is to say then that even though I certainly would agree with you that dying is bigger than all our ideas about it, and if that were persuasive enough, then everyone would die reasonably well tuned to all these things. And my experience was easily 95% of all the people I work with died a bad death.
Yes, I certainly understand that. And I just want to note in the Buddha's favor here that his verse begins, many do not realize that we here must die. I think that continues, that many here do not realize that we here must die, because I think whatever it is that distracts people, whether it is the consumer culture or whether it is something else that's distracting, that the realization that we here must die is something that requires more than just being here. You know, it's something that requires paying attention in a certain way. And I agree with you also that unfortunately the consumer culture that I'm in North America does buy and sell everything, including mindfulness and death and all of that. And I noticed in the movie you talked about the death trade, and I assumed you meant the buying and selling that went on around that. Um, and I think whatever it is that keeps people from paying attention to the nature of existence actually does remove them, you know, from, I would say, you know, one of the things that seems apparent to me, and my husband of many years got early onset Alzheimer's, died a 10-year death, and I was very much a part of it over the entirety of the arc of that. And then, you know, in his dying, very much a part of it, washing the body, shaving him, dressing him, and all of it. And and I had been with my parents through their dying, um, but there was something that I learned in his dying. There was something I learned that was impossible to learn in any other way. But there are many people who have their loved ones dying and don't learn that. They're not so close to the experience. So, you know, I very much agree with you. I mean, I'm surprised that 95% would be what you would say. That seems higher than what I might have thought, but I'm not surprised that it's a large majority or percentage of people that you've worked with
Mhm.
that actually, while they're going through their dying, are still refusing it, I guess you're saying, or they're afraid, or is that what you mean?
Not really. Which leads me to the other item I was going to, in a
Mhm.
gentle way, uh, reimagine it. The announcement that everybody will die, that we have to die, that phrase. Now,
Mm.
this is going to sound like a grammar lesson. It's going to start that way, but it's not going to end that way. And it goes like this. So, as a therapist, you would be one way or another a fan as well as a practitioner of the English language, I'm sure, and its various complexities and its confoundments from time to time. So you might find this compelling. So we have verbs in the English language, and we know what they do. And they have a voice, as it's called in grammar. In English, there's basically two. One is active and one is passive. And all the verbs appear to fit neatly into one of those two categories. And for the sake of people who are listening, to remind them the difference between passive and active. Active is what you do. Passive is what is done to you, basically. Okay, now the verb that we're talking about right now is the verb to die. So I won't put you through the ordeal. I'll just tell you what happens when I do put people through the ordeal. It goes like this. Please use the verb to die in the passive voice in a sentence in proper English without torturing the language too much. So at first, a lot of people just look at me because it's simply it doesn't compute as a proposition. Use the verb to die in the passive voice. But eventually they come around, okay, passive, right? What's done to me? Okay. And they start to take shots. And the first thing that happens is they don't use the verb to die. They approximate it with alleged synonyms. And I say, no, the verb that we're talking about is the verb to die. Don't replace it with anything else now. You're going to find this valuable. Try again. Eventually, the closest that they can come is that they use the verb to die in the past tense, imagining that this achieves the passive voice. See? So the first thing to realize, by the way, I mean, it's no secret, it's not possible to do. So it's a confounding, it's a magic trick of a sort. I take the ordinariness of the verb to die and demonstrate that you cannot use it in the passive voice in a sentence in any kind of proper English, right? So, but more importantly, when people are using the past tense to approximate the passive voice, it's whispering something about the involuntary existential orientation to the act of dying, which I think is this. Passive means what happens to you. Past tense means it's gone. It's over. There's nothing to be done. It's finished. It's gone. It's lost. Now we're getting some of the verbs that are used as synonyms for died. Gone. Lost is a big one, of course. So now, of course, the past tense is in no sense the passive voice. But in our understanding of the past tense, we've, without thinking about it too much, routinely come to the conclusion when we employ it that it's gone. By definition, everything that's past has departed from us, is no more, is unavailable, and will never come back. That's essentially the construct, right? So the English language is telling us, and it is a mongrel in many ways, but it retains some remarkable agility from time to time. And this is one example. The English language is whispering to us very clearly that you cannot actually use the verb to die in the past tense because dying is what you do. It can only be used in the active voice. One more point then to follow from this. If that's true linguistically, it's possible to live that out existentially and phenomenologically. And if I certainly am persuaded that it is, if dying is what you do, it raises heretofore an unthinkable proposition that challenges what the Buddha's observing. That is, if dying is what you do, it is possible not to do it.
Okay.
Here's what I mean by that. If dying was simply an expiration of your vital signs, if that's all it was, then I think we can all be in agreement that it is something that happens to you and everyone will do it. I know it's a strange way of characterizing it. It'll happen to us all and all of us will do it. But if dying is more generously understood as a whole person undertaking, not an inevitability at all, but in fact, a momentous challenge psychically and spiritually and basically in every way you can imagine. It is more than conceivable then that when the time of physical deterioration comes, you can simply opt out of the enterprise of dying. And people did on my watch all the time. And a case could well be made, and maybe we can talk about it later if you're so inclined, that euthanasia, the legalization of euthanasia, is, among other things, intentionally or otherwise, a way of seeing to it that you don't have to die.
Huh.
You see, because you can invoke something being done to you,
Yeah.
in place of what you would otherwise be obliged to do, which is to undertake the labors of dying.
Right.
You see,
Right.
so I
Yeah,
don't think
I see that.
it's Ouija board stuff or juju stuff to say it's possible not to die. It's not to say that you won't, that you'll somehow get out from under the expiration of your vital signs. But the work that a human being is called to during the course of dying is easily something to be set aside. And that's what the 90+% figure that I was mentioning to you.
I see.
It comes from an understanding that it's possible to take the entirety of your dying time and spend it not dying.
It's like offline. It's taking it offline. It's taking it out of, I mean, I think what you're saying, I'm following it. And I was an English teacher originally. So I thought maybe that was a trick because my mind was going through all the possibilities of the passive to die. But I think what you're saying is that the act of dying can be avoided and that a lot of people want to avoid it. Is that a fair way of paraphrasing?
Rather than use the phrase "the act of dying," which kind of makes it sound fairly discreet and contained.
Yeah. Okay.
I would use the language of the work of dying.
Okay, the work of dying, the engagement with dying. It's a process. I mean, it's reminded me very much of giving birth, going through the dying process that I've gone through, which has been, really with people I'm close to, with 5 people, and going through the entirety of it without much. One person had quite a bit of medication, but she'd also had quite a bit of pain. The other people did not. And in the birth process, I didn't have medication, and I had large babies. So to me, they were very similar in terms of that engagement in something that is not, it's not instantaneous. But I've never thought about the fact that people wanting to be put out of their awareness would be actually avoiding or disengaging from the work of dying. Somehow I just hadn't thought about it that way, but I can see it. And what do you think is going on with that 90 to 95% of people in your experience apparently they want this kind of, I'm going to call it disengagement from what you're calling the work of dying? Why do they want that?
I wouldn't characterize it as something that they want necessarily, because that makes it sound like it's more or less chosen.
I see.
And what I saw is people more or less come to it by default, by virtue of so few other demonstrable other human examples to draw upon.
I see.
That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I think it's a truism. I don't have many of them, but I will stand by this one. People die in the manner of their living.
Yes, I've heard that many times. Yes.
That being the case, if you've lived your life in a death-phobic culture, and one of the conditions of your citizenship is to understand that you have an obligation to be flippant or dismissive or remote where dying is concerned, to consider that all the work of dying is premature, at least until you receive a terminal diagnosis. If then, all of this is more or less bound to incline you to imagine dying as something unbecoming, not fitting, not necessary, not mandatory, not kind or merciful, not not much of a presence, but a kind of anti-presence, a kind of self-annihilation, a kind of the full termination of your capacity for humanhood, for elderhood, depending on how old you are at the time, for parenthood, if you're a parent at the time of your dying, and so on. So you bring your death phobia with you to your own deathbed. It's not that you mean to do so, but the amazing thing is, in your times of relative health, death phobia seems to work. And so now you're in a different kind of zone with respect to your health. This is not normally a time when people suddenly deeply second guess themselves.
Right.
You know what I mean? This is the time where people double down on what they're sure of, right?
Yeah.
As you've seen, no doubt, in your practice 1,000 times.
Yeah.
So that being the case, you would not expect people to come to their dying time as an opportunity to have their fundamental take on things challenged or wondered about or cast into a different light than it seemed to be. And no matter how serviceable it seemed to be when you're in relative health, the truth of the matter is, when you're not healthy anymore, nothing looks like it did. And you are at great pains to maintain, as they unfortunately refer to it, as normal a life as possible under the circumstances. Because your normal life is the first casualty of your unwitting or unwilling drawing nigh to your own death.
Right. Yeah. So you see that it's the death phobic culture that forms the attitude, or that shapes people in a way that leads them almost passively into this kind of, I guess, lack of interest in dying. I mean, from my point of view, and often in working with people in therapy also, I bring up the idea of interest in dying, because again, from a Buddhist perspective, this is the realm of life and death, and they aren't separated. So you really can't say, now I'm living and now I'm dying. Again, that goes against the general cultural view. But, once we get past a certain age, one of the most interesting things that lies out there is dying. It's a big adventure. It's one of the last big adventures. And, but I think, again, like you're saying, you're seeing people who haven't prepared for the adventure. And I think another thing that you're pointing out that I've seen all the time, and it's so concerning, is that many people, that I would say, by far the majority of people, probably around 95% of people I see in therapy, have not seen someone die. And so I highly recommend it, and many people do in the process of the therapy, because I see a lot of baby boomers. I see a lot of people that are oldish, and so the people around them are also oldish. And so the idea that we would come to our own death, and not by this being an accident, but more like something that seemed to be part of the plan. We would never have seen anybody else die. It makes it seem so foreign and alien, and really unspeakable in a way, because you haven't seen it. You haven't noticed what it is. And even in the birth process now, most women who do give birth have seen somebody give birth, or at least they've seen movies in which they saw that or something. It's not like completely alien where it was perhaps, in the middle of the 20th century for some women. But this notion that people have never seen, maybe they've seen an animal die, but they've never seen another human being actually die. It's a very strange thing. It seems very strange to me that it's part of our culture.
Yeah. Well, two points to offer in response to what you've said. The first one is, excuse me, you might have seen someone expire and still not seen anyone die. because expiration is not the same thing.
Uh-huh.
You might have been a witness to this stout refusal to die throughout the course of one's dying.
Uh-huh.
And if that's what you've seen, for example, as a younger person, then the example you bring to your own dying is a kind of strangely empty heroism of a kind, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it turns into a country and Western song, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. The other thing is, I'll tell you a little story. True story, really happened. Those are useful distinctions these days. So at some talk I did, a woman came up to me, and judging from her appearance, I would have guessed her to be in her mid-50s. And she said to me, well, it's all very interesting, which is usually dismissive. And I said, yeah, I think so myself. And she said, but really, it's not of much use to me. I said, I see. And then she was waiting for me to pursue the matter, but there's nothing to pursue. She said, would you like to know why? I said, well, if you're going to tell me, I'll be listening. He said, well, the reason it's not useful to me is because nobody close to me has died. Now, if we just stop the story for a second and you investigate someone in their mid-50s,
Yeah.
as a fact of life, this is virtually impossible.
Yes.
Okay, as a fact, but as a kind of inadvertent confession, this may be wickedly true after all, because you may not realize that what she's saying is she's never been close to anyone. And so the deaths of people in her orbit are of not much consequence, because the closeness, or the lack of closeness in that case, saw to it that there wouldn't be much consequence. So there you are. In other words, as I said earlier, however you live tends to be how you die. Whatever you brought to the fracas during the course of your brief but intense allotment among us tends to be what you bring to the third and final act. And you tend not to be able to choose suddenly between the examples of wit or wisdom that you imagined you carried with you throughout your days. The powerful thing about dying is that it's not that interested in your prior experience. It's not that interested in your opinions, your attitudes, your prejudices, your stances, your declarations, your motives. It just doesn't inquire. It's not dismissive. It just doesn't inquire. Finally, it's a routine and off-the-cuff response that I often would get, even in idle conversation, when this subject comes up, and somebody with what they imagine to be a heightened awareness will say, "Ah, well, we're all dying all the time."
I hear that too. Yes.
Okay, and I say, well, I don't know how you know that. I mean, you're speaking like this is an article of knowledge, not a declaration of faith, which it's much closer to the second. But let's examine it for a second. Everybody's dying all the time. I think this is your way of saying that that your recognition of impermanence is constantly having its way with you. And well, that would be, if that's true, that's a wonderful thing. But that's not the same thing as saying we're all dying all the time. And here's the real problem with that kind of small b undigested Buddhistic declaration, to my mind. It goes like this. If we're all dying all the time, then a terminal diagnosis is basically irrelevant. Changes nothing, alters nothing, brings nothing, takes nothing away, leaves everything basically unchanged. That's the allegation there. Well, you were dying anyway. You've always been dying. So this doesn't change anything. So it's no big deal. And there's the heroism I was talking about. Now, if you follow that idea down to its logical conclusion, this is what you end up with. So let's say someone in your family has a child, a newborn, and you're invited to come over and, do the necessary observing of the newborn and make the necessary oohs and ahs, right? So you look down into the bassinet to this young one who's sleeping off the ordeal of getting born. And then you look up with your stern small b Buddhism conviction and you say, not bad for a dying kid. And of course, people tend to laugh when you say that. And I say,
Yeah.
but doesn't it stand to follow, though, if everybody's dying all the time, then this child has already begun to die. And the only reason you wouldn't say it is because there's no sense rubbing the parent's face in the fact. Or you wouldn't say it because it wouldn't even occur to you to say it. And why wouldn't it occur to you to say it? Because when you look into the face of a newborn, your undigested declaration that everybody's dying all the time escapes you entirely for at least a brief period of time, no? Right. So in other words, you can tell what I'm saying here is, and I have no reason to exaggerate this. I was at the deathbed of hundreds and hundreds of people. And I can tell you with no hesitation that we have an obligation to allow a terminal diagnosis to change everything. That's what it's supposed to do. It is supposed to address you directly and mercilessly. And it doesn't blink because it doesn't have the wrong guy. And it doesn't have the wrong address and it doesn't have the wrong day. It's your turn now. And so your fundamental obligation as a functioning human being is to allow all of your prior understanding of what this day would be like to be the first casualty of this day happening as it has done. Okay, so this is the very work I was talking about right at the beginning of our discussion, right? And this is why I say it's not inevitable that you will die. Far from it. What it asks of you, it's at least as likely as not that you will pass on the work.
That's interesting. I mean, again, I saw that kind of work that you were doing in the Grief Walker, in the film, working with the terminal diagnosis and working also with parents whose children have a diagnosis and that where things are, way overextended at the hospital, et cetera. But the way you're putting it is a little different than, it reminds me a lot of some Zen koans. I mean, there's a famous koan where, there's somebody in a coffin and the student knocks on the coffin, says to the teacher, is he alive or is he dead? And the teacher says, I will not say, I will not say. And that interchange goes on through the koan many times. And finally, that student grows old and has to look into that issue of not saying alive or dead. But again, that's a serious engagement with the issue of our existence. And what you're saying is that much of our society and culture remove us from that kind of engagement. That you feel that many people, many of the hundreds of people that you worked with, were not prepared for much of an engagement at all, even with a terminal diagnosis or a terminal diagnosis of a child. I wonder, to turn that around, how you look at the practice of living so that dying is engaged with it. I mean, is there a way that you have come to see those 5% of people who do it a different way, or, how you would say this, for me, a very interesting aspect of our existence is this aspect of dying, or whatever you want to call it, the decline and the dying part. They're quite extraordinary in terms of what they provide. At least it's been my experience, and it's very difficult to speak about it because many people have not had that experience. And so then it can seem as though, having had a husband that was my best friend and going through a 10-year process whereby he became a small child and then a toddler and then an infant, and was not able to speak or swallow or really move much at all by the end. But in the actual experience of his dying, he became very conscious. He was very, very engaged, and we were communicating quite well. And he had no cortex, because I'd seen the brain study 2 weeks before that. So, just going through that experience of 6 days and 6 nights with him, there's nothing that could have substituted in my life for that. But then if I try to speak to people about it, it seems like it's some alien thing. Or I've just found that I worry that sometimes in a public situation, I might actually harm people by speaking so positively of my experience of this whole process of early onset Alzheimer's ending in death. I mean, it wasn't that it wasn't a tragedy. In a certain way, it was a great tragedy. In another way, it was an extraordinary adventure, and I don't know myself what the practice is in life. I mean, I can say for myself, but not for others. And you've seen so many more people engage or not engage in the dying process. What do you recommend as a practice of living that brings you into that, or brings one into it, or could bring people?
Carnage.
Carnage?
Carnage or crisis, yeah. Mm-hmm.
You mean, okay, say more about that.
Yeah. Well, the etymology of the word crisis causes it not to resemble the way we use it today.
Mm.
The word crisis, it's a Greek word, which means something like the intersection of perhaps incompatible things. And that intersection, the very moment of the intersection, offers up to you a choice that heretofore never had to be made, because you have contention that's non-negotiable.
Uh-huh.
So in and of itself, it's not a horror show to have a crisis. In
Right.
and of itself, the reason that we deem it to be a pejorative encounter is because we're not inclined to have to engage this implacable difference, this implacable collision, you see? So a culture that's very big on personal rights and personal self-determination,
Mm-hmm.
and the hero's journey and all these matters, is just asking for it when it comes to crisis, right? Because a crisis is disowned instead of engaged,
Uh-huh.
or owned instead of disowned, even better. I mean, after all, it's your crisis. It belongs to you, not in a proprietary sense, but in a sense of it, after a fashion, it resembles you and your life. So you ought not to try to take it out to the corner and dump it in the blue box, you see, and turn it into somebody else's crisis. So typically, okay, here's another story. A woman got in touch with me maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and she said, so here's my dilemma. I've read Die Wise and Grief Walker and the whole thing, and so I'm very hip on what you're doing. Okay. And my father, we've been reasonably close lately, but growing up, it was not that easy. Okay. Now he's dying. Yes. And I'm basically the sole provider of care for him. Yes. So my question to you is, how can I give him a die-wise kind of death and respect the fact that he just won't really talk to me about how he's feeling about dying or what it means to him? In fact, he won't really talk about it at all, except to reduce it to a question of, did you take your drugs today? That kind of thing, and really nothing else. And of course, she's waiting for me to unfold the whole thing and make it infinitely doable and
Mm.
infinitely available. And I said, you can't.
Mhm.
She said, pardon? I said, no, in the terms of your question, you cannot provide the kind of death that you read about in the book I wrote and quote unquote, respect your father's insistence to not talk about it with you, period. It's not
Mm.
available to you. She was absolutely dumbfounded because apparently if I wrote a book, I have an answer to everything. I do have an answer to everything, but I don't have an answer that will satisfy you to everything.
Mm.
That's the difference. Because the dead end of her question was this: how can I respect my father's wishes not to talk about it? And then it doesn't matter what you say after that, because
Yeah.
that's the dead end, you see.
Right. Right.
So here's my point. Who says that her father's insistence on not dying needs to be, on not talking about dying, and therefore not dying probably, who says that needs to be respected? I know, and you know, that it's as like motherhood and apple pie, right? You got to respect,
Right.
People's preferences and their wishes.
Mhm.
What does respect mean? Does it
Mhm.
mean indulge? Does it mean
Mhm.
include? Does it mean conspire? More often than not, the answer is yes.
Mhm.
So when I was in the death trade and I was confronted with this stuff all the time, I would say easily a couple of times a day. And I had to make up my mind to whom in the family circumstance did I owe what?
Hmm.
Who was my principal allegiance to? And if I had, sorted that out, what form was that allegiance supposed to take? So you can hear the question I was just asking a second ago in that question.
Yeah.
Invariably, I decided that my obligation, first and foremost, was to the patient and to the patient's dying in particular.
Uh-huh.
My debt of fidelity was to the dying of that person.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So once you decided that, many things are no longer available to you. And a few of them very intensely are. The things that are not available to you are to engage this as if you're in the customer satisfaction business.
Right.
Okay? So as long as the person is pleased with the nature of your contact with them,
Mhm.
all is well, and these are all good signs. But how do you, bearing in mind that the context we're talking about now is a death phobic culture,
Mhm.
and the deep likelihood is that the death phobia is manifest in the particular dying of this particular person on this particular day.
Uh-huh.
You have to be alert for it to register upon you, but it's not unreasonable to assume that it's there in some measure, in some fashion. So now, if I'm a customer satisfaction practitioner, then the only way I can really achieve that goal is to leave more or less undisturbed the death phobia and all its prevailing prejudices that
Mhm.
this person is operating by as they enter into their dying time. That you have no other choice, because as soon as you begin to wonder aloud about the necessity of these prejudices, the practicability of them, the advisability of them, the wisdom of them, the cowardice of them, and so on. Of course, you're on a headlong collision course with this person's self-determination.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So let's go a step further now. No doubt in your country, as in mine, there's a practice called living will, or
Dying with dignity, it's called. Well, I'm sorry,
no, it's
living
not
will.
dying with
Yes,
dignity.
no,
No,
no.
a
You're
living
talking
will.
about your advanced
I'm talking
directive.
about the advance directive.
Right.
Okay. Now, this is designed to do what? In North America, it's designed to see to it that even though you might be in some fashion or other out of your mind and no longer compos mentis and all the rest, still you can exercise dominion over what becomes of you. That's basically what it's for. Now, the mechanism by which this dominion is exercised goes like this. You sit here reasonably unafflicted, and you imagine the circumstance in which enough already finally appears.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And from that imagining, you design a scheme or an understanding, and you entrust it to others, whereby you say, you will act on the following instructions, that if I'm unable to do this or whatever it is, then no further measures in whatever the jurisdiction that you're living in allows. Okay. All sounds very good until you wonder whether or not when you get there, it will look anything like what you thought it would look like when you were dictating the terms and conditions as a complete amateur,
Right.
as a stranger in a strange land.
Right.
Okay. So what it means is, when you arrive at the land that you anticipated, generally speaking, it has to do with the bathroom. And dignity takes the form of who wipes who.
Mm-hmm.
And it all is down to that. When you get there, it doesn't look quite as unbearable as you imagined it would. Now you're in the position of changing the terms and conditions of your advance directive, except your disease process has advanced tremendously. And now everybody in a position of authority, including your family, is listening to you talking about wanting to change the terms of your advance directive. And they're saying, this is the disease talking. This is the drugs talking. And you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This is despair or depression talking.
Right.
At which point you're being second guessed. Oh my God. And now you're in a real twilight zone.
Uh-huh.
Because now you're second guessing yourself.
Uh-huh.
Is it really as bad as I thought? Is it really bad, but I don't realize how bad it is, and they do, and so I got to listen to, and round and round and round it goes. So my point is that your dying is not the place for you to be exercising dominion. Those days are officially over, and they've been over for some time. That's the invitation of the visitation of your dying, to take your maniacal, habituated, forceful insistence on being yourself and giving it a rest for the duration.
So who does it rest with?
What's the it?
You're dying.
Who does it rest with?
I mean, you're saying that it can't really rest with the self-determination that's made in advance of the experience.
Yeah.
And so, and you were saying, and I saw it also in, in the work that you were doing, that you challenge people with a sense of a willingness to conflict with whatever the customer satisfaction is. And so I was just wondering that, the sense of engagement in the process, if that individual, like the father who says, I don't want to talk about it, if that individual is not willing to engage, do you have a sense of what's next? I mean, I'm asking here, more or less your advice or view for a kind of a practice or an orientation towards either practicing when walking around life, practicing so that dying is an engagement, or give up something and then others around that person, do something that allows for the engagement. Or do we just, say, there are so many people that are so disengaged that we just leave it alone? I'm really asking that. I mean, it may sound like it's rhetorical, but I'm asking.
No, in fact, you asked me this already, and my answer last time was crisis.
Right.
Okay, so this is what I'm recommending. What I'm saying is, if you don't have a fairly steady diet of the ultimate defeat of your self-determination,
right,
then your dying will be utterly catastrophic.
Yes.
And it will be a nihilistic encounter of the worst kind. You see, because you've got no practice in laying down the burden of being yourself.
Right.
You see?
Right.
The
Yeah.
truth of the matter is that in your dying, you have no obligation to be a consistent somebody. Why?
Mhm.
Because your dying is typically not consistent with the rest of your life.
Yes.
So it asks different kinds of things.
Right.
So you can't rest on the old repertoire.
Right.
And the new repertoire is how do you end? Are you ended or do you end? Do
Hmm.
you just hold on for dear life or don't hold on for dear life? Or okay,
Hmm.
so your question to me about a practice in a walking around life is, here's the good news. You have nothing to wait for that gives you an opportunity to practice what I'm talking about.
Hmm.
Because everyone's death before your own
Hmm.
is your chance to get it right.
Hmm.
Okay, that's number one. But don't be as extreme as to just isolate it around dying specifically, because really dying is a particularly strenuous version of the endings and the frailties and the limits that accompany us through our days.
Right.
But North Americans are not, they're not good with limits. I mean, I somebody sent me a piece of news today that said one of the few businesses that's booming in the last 6 months is your business,
Yes. It is.
the mental
It
health
is.
business, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So from a big point of view, there's a big question point of view. Why? Let me wonder it as an outsider.
Hmm.
Well, so okay, there's the obvious. There's a lot of challenges to hearth and home. Financially, that's a big one. I
Hmm.
myself have made virtually no money almost in a year now, so I
Hmm.
understand. I understand, but it's not likely that that disemployment for the course of X number of months will land you in therapy. It's not that likely.
Right.
There usually has to be other things.
Yeah.
Okay. And a buildup, and a considerable buildup too, a kind of buildup that getting a job won't fix.
Hmm.
There. Okay. So I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that the reason therapy is enormous business right now is because North Americans' quasi-religious orientation to the sanctity of their self-determination and their ability to drive the bus in their own life
Uh-huh.
is not working.
Uh-huh.
And the odds are, for the foreseeable, it's not going to work.
Right.
No matter what you believe, what's going on is bigger than your beliefs.
Hmm.
It simply takes your beliefs, hands them to you in a paper bag, and says, if you still need these, here they are. But it's not clear that they're that useful.
Unfortunately, though, I just want to bring up this little side bit here to I think that you're correct in everything you're saying, and yet I also think that putting on a mask serves for a lot of people in a way that is almost unimaginable in terms of the security apparently that is afforded them, because I've seen a kind of moralizing or even a morality developed around wearing a mask.
Sure.
And it's like the morality that used to be there with the recycling. You're willing to attack somebody else who's not doing it correctly, and you're doing it correctly yourself. And so this wearing of the mask thing strikes me as a protection against the feelings of helplessness. And then I live in an area where there's really almost no virus. Honestly, the probability of being in contact with this virus where I live is probably at the level of being hit by lightning. But people are wearing masks a lot, and maybe more so than in the beginning of the shutdown.
Yeah.
And there's more moralizing about it. So it does give me the feeling that that sense of retaining control and self-determination has been visited on this mask thing, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and that it's a communication, it's an appearance, it's a way of looking virtuous, but it's also a morality in the way people are behaving.
Mm.
So, there's a way that the rules that people have been given for conducting themselves during COVID have taken on the meaning of life. I mean, they've taken on maybe the thing that you're talking about, the self-determination that one can still do. And I don't feel that vulnerability in my walking around life when I'm out walking around in town or I'm at the co-op or whatever. I feel the moralizing more about the mask and the social distancing. So I do think that the confinement and whatever it is that is going on, that I'm not sure I understand it all by any means, but it certainly is different. What's happening now is very different. I think it sends people in different directions. I mean, some people simply look for that new sense of control, you know, and that this is what it is. I get very few people coming to therapy, even people that have otherwise. I mean, I see all the neurotic Buddhists in the area. I mean, you know, for years it's been my niche is to see Buddhists who are neurotic. And I understand that form of suffering. I mean, I truly do. And very often, you know, I'm very sympathetic to the whole deal. But, you know, even among my most sort of thoughtful therapy people, I don't find much questioning about the procedures that have been recommended to protect us from this virus. And that's why I don't know if this is a crisis. It seems more like people are acting like it's all normal, you know, that we're going to be going on social distancing, wearing masks, staying away from each other, not having any chance to go to theater or music event. I mean, it's just, I have the sense, and I do feel it's the same thing you're talking about that's working now to cover up any sense of crisis. Do you see what I mean? I mean, does that make sense? And, you know, I wonder about that.
Well, there's a couple of things. One is your characterization, particularly around the moralizing that the mask induces and carries at the same time, may be more a condition of the place that you live and the country you live in than it would be across the board, a universal constant across the whole globe.
I agree. Yeah.
It's a big deal. And I mean, you guys have just been through and continue to go through, I mean, honestly, the adjectives escape. As those of us who are watching it from a distance are completely dumbfounded that any country would expose themselves ongoingly and flirt with doing it another 4 years. Oh my God.
Yeah.
And come that close. I mean, okay. So anyway, so the point I'm making is what I started with. When we generalize from our neighbors across the you know, wealth of humanity, there's a lot of casualties in doing so, right? And to my mind, cultural tendencies tend to prevail over idiosyncratic tendencies. Or you could say that the idiosyncratic tendencies find their expression through culturally endorsed, culturally informed, culturally employed fashion. Right? And in that sense, my own orientation to life tends to be that really culture comes first and last. And, you know, the picadillos of personality appear in between those two poles, but generally they really don't determine things. And that makes me a bit of an outlier compared to a sort of stereotypical American take on things, which is the primacy of the individual really prevails and should prevail, and all of that sort of thing. What is the deep challenge to self-determination that this virus clearly has become very quickly? What does it mean? To my mind, it means that it gives whatever culture we're talking about, the opportunity to wonder, maybe for the first time in its generational life, what it holds most dear, and whether or not its principal convictions have been tested in the near past, and whether in fact this crisis is an opportunity involuntarily to wonder about things that you'd be disinclined to wonder about left to your own devices. And this is why I think there's so much sort of mental health dilemmas that are on the horizon and are going to be adamant for at least a year. And I think the advent of a vaccine is unlikely to change that very much, because it's not about whether or not you could die from this thing.
Right.
What it's really about is my ability to, quote, be safe, which is, what you started with in your
Right.
introduction, is not dependent on what I do nearly as much as it depends on the circumspect willingness of the people around me to proceed, understanding that the consequences of their involvements and behaviors will have consequence for me. See, and that's not negotiable. That's a fact. Right. So the only way I can get sick here on the farm is if the people working on the farm are relaxed in town.
Right.
Because I'm here almost all the time.
Right. Right.
So that means my ability to remain healthy is not really a consequence of how I'm carrying myself nearly as much as my desire to carry myself with my companions here in a fashion that entrusts my health to them. And fundamentally, that's what community is, to my mind. Where you have a corrupted community, or I should say the corruption of the notion of community or village mindedness, my preferred term, really manifests when suddenly the question of individual choice becomes the banner under which so many people congeal, when the challenge is to the collective. And that you have to realize that your ability to be this individual and cling to your individuality is conferred upon you by the sanity and the health of the culture. That's where it comes from. And minus a sane culture, you won't have the opportunity to be a righteous individual.
Right. I mean, I hear you pressing hard on the issue of, American sort of autonomy, or the sort of idea of the autonomous individual. And I can appreciate that, but I also appreciate some of what Charles Eisenstein brings up in Coronation, like risk taking. How much do we give up? In terms of, if we want to be together, and if we want our children to be together, if we want the community to have the capacity to congregate and to engage, what's the risk worth for doing that? And so a part of what I have difficulty with is that where I live, the numbers are so low. And I can look at the statistics every day and I can figure out the probability really easily.
Yeah.
And so I do know the reality of at least the statistics that we have, and what else can we trust? We've had a lot of people tested and et cetera. And maybe the tests do have very high false negatives or false positives, whatever. I can actually say that I would prefer to take some risk, to be close to people that I care about, to help people have their shops stay open, to engage in my community. And I don't have a choice about that. And where this kind of the issue about safety and risk and the benefit of community and relationship, to me, they kind of intersect on this one issue. And it's really one of the reasons why I got in touch with you. I wrote an essay for the Psychology Today blog about elders dying alone. And, 80% of the deaths in America from the COVID have been people over 65 years old. And that's not to mention all the people that were dying over 65 years old. That's just 80% of deaths from COVID.
Yeah.
So during the time of the lockdown, and even continuing now in some of the care centers, people couldn't be visited by their family members when they were dying.
Yeah.
And that included children in hospitals. All sorts of people died without family members. Somebody that I saw in therapy, she and her husband, had gone to South America, and they came back. Turned out they were both positive for COVID, but he had a chronic disease. She didn't have any symptoms, and he died from COVID-related concerns. She saw him in the ICU on an iPad for a few moments before he died. And that's the reason why she got back in touch with me, were that those circumstances, she had no choice. She would have put on a hazmat suit. She would have put on the protective gear, but she had no choice. And so to have people so separated from the dying people, without a choice to put protective gear on and sign a form saying, I'm willing to risk it. And to do that for so many thousands of people, a lot of people died during this time.
Yep.
Without any family around. And for me, this was unimaginable, really unimaginable, because of my own experience with my own loved ones dying, and the intimacy of it and the nature of it, and that so many people were just deprived without any choice, of the experience, the people that were dying, but then their loved ones who might have been willing to actually accompany them. That, to me, made some sort of mark on my sense of what's valuable in life. And, how do we function if we're scared of a virus or a pandemic or whatever it is we're scared of? Does it cut us off from, our sense of care or community, or what's going on? That really that just stumped me.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe that there weren't huge protests or people saying, this is outrageous to let people die like this. What do you think about that? I've sort of said a lot of different things here, but it's the closeness of community and the willingness to take risk in order to be with the people that we love that I feel has been undermined, or at least made silent by this situation.
Yeah. Well, I think the heart of the matter in what you've talked about might be this. In your comments there, I think that you were making a distinction between a sense of community and the willingness to undertake personal risk. Okay. So I'd like to suggest to you that it's not personal risk. Okay. The willingness to risk your personal health, the consequences of doing so are unlikely to remain isolated to you. That's the nature of this beast. Okay. Now I agree with you completely. There's nothing to talk about in terms of numbers. In the early going, I think we all remember visions of people collapsing and dying in the streets in piles. That's what was coming in at the beginning. So, that's like horror movie stuff. And it's clear that not only has that not happened, but it's very unlikely to happen almost no matter what we do or don't do.
Right.
Because it's not that fatal to that many people.
Right. We're in a different point of the understanding the virus right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the first thing to say is that the actions that you're describing, the isolating actions and so on, were certainly part of the initial panicky attempt to respond.
Right.
Right. And whoever was, delineating the practices in ER and so on. I mean, I've been there. I've worked in that circumstance.
Mhm.
I mean, not in the case of of a pandemic, mind you, but certainly having a sense of people trying to tread water, if you will,
Mhm.
trying to figure out what to do next, how to, and they themselves don't forget in the early going, we're taking sick and dying too, the people who were working in the blue smocks and so on. So this was not the time when the best part of your country or mine was most manifest. Okay.
Right.
It was panicky and it was, okay. So we're in a different time now, which I think some of your comments earlier, you alluded to the possibility that many people are almost getting used to it. And I'd agree with you. It's becoming, to a certain degree, normalized. And
Yeah.
we will find out very quickly that normalizing a pandemic will not make us more mentally sound.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. I mean, we know that human beings can get used to a lot of monstrous things. And
Mhm.
it's not an indication of health to be able to do so. It's a coping strategy, which is
Mhm.
not really a cardinal point on the compass of health.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's necessary, but only in very acute and very temporary circumstances, right?
Right.
Okay. So, to my mind, one of the things we could lament about most is that the pandemic, the virus, turns out not to be as heavy-handed as we had initially imagined.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is because it's not as bad as we were hearing at the beginning and fearing
Right.
so intensely.
Right.
And that not as bad quality
Mhm.
is now having the consequence of all the second guessing,
Mhm.
you see. I mean, where you're living is like where I'm living. The last I heard, there were so few cases for hundreds of square miles that if you talk in terms of chances, I absolutely don't understand the point though of saying, you're going to get hit by lightning more likely.
Just
Me getting hit by-
probabilities. It's just I know the probabilities.
Yes, but my point is that
Yeah.
whatever we're not really living a life of likelihoods.
Mhm.
We're living a life of choices and secondarily and remotely of the consequences of
Mhm.
making those choices. Here's an example of what I mean. Some years ago, I was asked to come and teach at a alternative high school in out on the West Coast, and it's a long story. The short version is, I got there. They played Grief Walker during the course of the morning announcements, and so all these alternative high school kids got it in their head that they were going to subvert who my appearance was for, and they were all going to come down. The whole friggin' school basically came to the session. So the place is full. And after a few remarks, I turned it into a question and answer thing. And the very first question was from a 15 or 16-year-old, very fierce looking, all gothed up young girl, young woman, a girl playing with womanhood. And she said, I have a right to kill myself.
Mhm.
That's all she said, and sat back down again, very pleased with herself.
Mhm.
So you can imagine all the teachers in the back of the hall just freaked out
Mhm.
because, all the manuals say you are not supposed to talk about suicide with adolescents,
Mhm.
particularly not in a place that's publicly funded. Why not? Because to talk about it seems to be misunderstood as to counsel it. If you
Mhm.
talk about it, you're considering the possibility and you're one step away from, quote, permission. So there's the dynamic. But I wasn't a hireling of the system, and I had a different response. And this is how I responded. And I think now you'll see why I'm telling you. I said to her, okay, I said, this is certainly not a question. This is a kind of declaration, and I think you're challenging me. Okay, let's see what happens. So my first question to you is, do you have anybody in this world that you love? And she just glared at me because as a 15-year-old, it's none of my business, right? But I'm not the one who spoke. She's the one who spoke. Number one. Number two, she's talking like she thinks adults talk.
Mhm.
Okay, then I'll treat you as if you're an adult. You're not, and we'll soon both discover that you're not, but you've set the terms and conditions, so here we go. So do you have somebody in this world that you love? I said, I'm not asking for names, just do you at all? And she said, of course, and I said, okay, good. Second question, do you have people in this world who love you? It's not often the same list. Often there's not a lot of intersection between those two lists, but do you? And she glared at me like this is absolutely pointless. And she said, yes. I said, okay. So here's the thing. If you exercise this right of yours and you're successful, what it means, and it's not a matter of opinion, is that you're asking at least one of those people that I just asked you about to find you or to identify you on a slab somewhere. That's what you mean, right? That's what you have in mind by your right, the exercise of your right. You do mean that too. You do include that, right? I asked her. And the whole place went still, of course, as it should, and went silent because nobody heard that coming. Because nobody heard that the exercise of personal rights has consequences beyond what anybody intends. And in the case of suicide, the suicidal person is not obliged to live out one of those consequences for a nanosecond.
Right.
So they put them all into motion, and then they abandon the rest of us to those consequences. And this is called a right. But what it is a child's understanding of a right that has no consequence. You see? Okay.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm telling you this story is to say, well, I have no position to occupy and to argue with respect to personal determination in this regard, safety, the primacy of community, people being blocked out of being with their loved ones as they die. But I would like to observe on behalf of those of us who are just in a general and human way confounded by the intricacy of this challenge, that our exercise of our right, if it does not carry a sort of conscious and deliberate willingness to acknowledge the consequences, if it doesn't do that, I'm not sure it's a right. It's something much closer to an indulgence. And indulgences, particularly in a time like this, really can't be countenanced, I wouldn't say. So it's important that the moral, complexity of the thing really show up when we're talking about it, and that we not occupy a particular stance or other to the exclusion of the subtleties of things just to make a point, or just to win or appear to have thought the thing through. There's no doubt that one of the hardest things that some portion of a generation of people will live with for the rest of their lives is looking at their expiring loved one through plexiglass or through a screen, as you said. No doubt.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably my own concerns are complicated by the fact that I am a Buddhist, and because in Buddhism, as you probably know, the moment and the time of dying are very important, and the situation, the causes and conditions of that transition are actually quite important. They stand out from many, many other situations in existence. And so to have, I happen to have a good friend who went into a care center for some mental health reasons, and then got locked down there, and then cut off from everybody, and then unable to even, be visited by her daughter, and so on and so forth. Not an unusual story for people who are, and this was in a residential care center, not a medical facility. And it's more the way that I think probably this is true from my perspective, and maybe not from yours, that transition of consciousness at the time of dying is an important aspect of one's existence. And fortunately, I did not have somebody that I was unable to visit except for this friend, which whom I visited under constrained circumstances. But I suppose what occurred to me is that if if one of my loved ones were in a situation, I would want the possibility of putting on protective gear, going through all of the quarantining and whatever else, in order to have that experience, as opposed to somebody else saying you can't have it. It's not available to you, because I do feel that the involvement in the dying process is part of a certain kind of love for that individual,
No doubt.
as that mind stream
No
goes
doubt.
forward.
But how about this though? Why wait? There's no doubt. There's no difference of opinion between you and I on
Yeah.
the deep importance of attending to that time.
Yeah.
I was there a lot. Okay, so
Yeah.
you're not talking to somebody who's just has an opinion about it.
Right.
But here's my point. If you wait to attend to the realities of dying until the realities of dying are firmly and relentlessly upon you,
Yeah.
you are not firing on all cylinders. You're
Right.
not coming at it from your best capacity or not, at least not necessarily. So my point is this: if you wait, there is such a thing as too late. And that's what grown-ups know. There's such a thing as too late. And those of us in the helping professions have an obligation, I think, to people that we're working with to represent that reality to them.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you
There are
completely. Yeah.
consequences that you will not claw back.
Right. Oh, right. I agree with you
So
completely. Yeah.
it's very possible then that the circumstance, the real lamentable circumstance that you describe, right, where people can't get close to someone who's dying and so on, can obviously get swept up into the kind of administrative mania of the local magistrates and jurisdictions and all of that stuff. But somewhere in there, those of us who are willing to know the inconvenient stuff have to be willing to say, if you waited until the middle of a sort of a widespread calamity like this to hold dear the issues of dying, and then all the realities come, as we've both just acknowledged, you're not going to be able to snatch the golden ring. The chances are very good that the circumstance will dictate to you what's available, what's possible, and what's not. Right? Yeah. And of course, this is exactly what's happening. So there's nothing to wait for, is the point. I know there's people that are in the circumstance. I know that. Right. For the moment, I'm talking about all the people who are not in that circumstance.
Right.
Look at each other and imagine that such a thing could come to pass, and then conduct yourself accordingly, minus it coming to pass.
Yes. Yes. No, I agree with you about that. I mean, I think that, again, the nature of life and death and its entanglement, the existence really is living and dying, I think brings out opportunities all the time to engage with the dying side of life. And from my point of view, again, even in working with people in therapy on this, once people really begin to realize that these two things, life and death, are not separated, it does actually change their view of everything. It's not like it's not like a small issue where you begin to see, oh, your father had these conditions from his childhood, and then your grandfather had these conditions. To me, that's a great insight to see that your parents were also born into families, and those families had conditions, etc. But to me, that's still a small insight compared to the insights around seeing that living and dying are together. and that you don't ever actually have any moment of living that isn't also engaged with dying. I mean, you can see that just by the fact that, you're, from the moment you come in, you're dying. Like you said, you look at that newborn has come in living and dying. And birth itself is a situation where either, I mean, I know when I was giving birth, I was very scared of my dying or the baby dying. It wasn't just giving birth. It was this initiation into living and dying.
Mhm.
And so I couldn't agree with you more about the importance of coming to terms with this on an ongoing basis. And I like the fact in Grief Walker that you said, when we bring our children into the world, we're also bringing them into their dying. And to think about that as well, what will be the circumstances of our children's death?
Yeah.
And I assumed that you were saying that in part because of the work that you were doing, that you were aware for your son. I mean, I don't know if you have other children, but he was in the movie, that you were thinking along those lines.
Sure, of course.
Yeah, yeah.
Listen, I have to go.
Yes, and you've been very generous. You've been very kind, and you've been very thorough.
So if there was something that you wanted to make sure you got to before we ended, we could end with it now.
I think only if you have anything to say. You've said a great deal about the virus and how this moment in time, gives us a certain kind of teaching about, not caring about oneself as an individual so much, but the consequences for a larger community. But I wondered if there's anything else that you'd want to say, I guess, about going forward now, because there's a huge amount of chaos and confusion about just what is going on, actually. And not that there isn't that kind of confusion all the time in life, but at least it's on everybody's mind right now. So I wonder if you have anything that you'd want to say in addition to what you've already said about this, this particular moment.
Well, I certainly talked a lot about it one way or another. And the
Yeah.
thing, when we appeared not to be talking about the virus, can be easily applied to the circumstance. But yes, for what it's worth, it's uncharted territory.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever prior experiences we bring to bear upon this thing are not that useful. Would that we were willing to learn instead of trying to be right.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is a school of a sort that
Mm-hmm.
we're in. And it's important to remember that it's not inevitable that you will learn just because you're in school, and learning's not free.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And learning, last time I checked, seems to be a kind of unbidden encounter with unwelcome things about what you know. See? And so what's the advent of the virus, among a host of other things, strikes me as our chance to learn how to learn, and to do so more or less deliberately, and to realize that learning is extremely expensive because it's so hard on your convictions, and it's supposed to be, right? So we're coming to the virus as relative amateurs in terms of crisis, in terms of certainly anything global, because climate collapse is taking too long. So we simply can't come to it that way. I mean, I say that with tragic irony, but it's still the case. This thing, it's not clear that the vaccine will end it. It's not clear what the end of it will look like, but I'm absolutely certain that the end of the virus per se will not be the end of its consequences, not by a long shot.
Right.
And
that's for sure.
We will be living out the unimagined consequence of having to have learned that our fellows endanger us, whether they mean to or not, and that we are someone else's fellow.
Mm-hmm.
We were in a position to endanger people without wanting to or meaning to.
Mm-hmm.
So how did we carry that deeply unsought consequence? In that sense, we've become bizarrely important by virtue of being a possible carrier and a vector for this thing. It's the kind of self-importance nobody imagined for themselves. And, you know, this is going to be hard on people who are prone to feeling bereft or adrift when they're not in charge. It already is, and it will continue to be.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the learnings available to us is, you know, it's not that precious a possession to be able to self-determine. And there's something about I'm going to call it the holiness of the community that is there to be learned at great expense now. It seems to me the only way we can learn it in North America is to be willing to lay down a lot of former convictions about what was the most important thing. And personal rights and freedoms would appear in the context of a pandemic not to be the most important thing. And I would suggest maybe we could nurse along that possibility beyond the reach of the pandemic and turn it into an understanding instead of an affliction.
Nice, very nice. Thank you. Thank you. That was a very good ending. And thank you for being so willing to talk for so long. It was really lovely meeting you.
Thank you.
And I hope that we meet again sometime. Thank you.
Yes, amen. Amen. Well, if I get to bring my band on the road, perhaps we'll come to your part of town if we're ever allowed to congregate.
You will come to this part of town, I'm sure, if you do.
Okay.
You'll be coming to Central Vermont. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. Take care.
In these times, whatever it was. And after that, well, it's best you come back with the gathering light, because people can see for themselves by then.